Well, hello. Here is the second part of the movie I promised. It's a Saturday and the weather's great, so I thought, why not have some fun on this Saturday and make a movie about the carbon cycle and how it's causing potentially global warming and the destruction of our world as we know it. So here we go. As I said, CO2 can be found in the atmosphere as a gas. Totally invisible, but it's up there. It's a greenhouse gas that is able to absorb energy from the sun, and it heats up and keeps heat on Earth, allowing this planet to not be a lifeless ice cube. So CO2 is not such a bad guy. It keeps us warm, but too much CO2 can make us a little too warm, which is kind of what's happening with the idea behind global warming and climate change and why it's so detrimental. But let's talk about CO2 getting absorbed, much like it did by that oak tree leaf. Let's say that CO2 is taken in by this time an aquatic photosynthetic organism, some algae, some very blurry, pixelated algae. And let's say that algae lives in a swamp. I mean that this cattail can take in that CO2 as well, but let's say this algae, beat it out, and it lives in a swamp. This here algae, and it takes in the CO2, and it does so with its chloroplast, just like the oak tree did. The chloroplast is this organelle inside the algae's cells that can do the process photosynthesis. Photosynthesis will take this CO2 and split it right here. So we have carbon and there's the oxygens, and they're now free from one another to reassemble into new molecules, such as this one. Here is oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon combining in certain amounts to become a sugar molecule. Here's our carbon that we're following around. Now let's say that glucose is, much like the last time, turned into a long, many-chain sugar called a starch, which this very blurry algae uses for food. And it would have used it for food, but we're going to pretend that the algae is now dead because the algae and its starches and that carbon molecule we're following around, it's going to get, for some reason, trapped at the bottom of this swamp, and it's going to get covered up by mud. Since it's covered up by mud, the algae can't do photosynthesis, so it dies. And it's not only going to be that algae, but let's say this algae and a bunch of its algae friends also meet their demise by falling to the bottom of that swamp and getting covered up by mud. Well, if that algae is then buried by even more layers of mud, okay, so more layers of mud from the swamp pile up over time, that algae will be transformed. That algae and its friends will just become this black, gooey hydrocarbon called oil. Now, the process of turning algae and other old life into oil takes a long, long time. And so this is how the carbon cycle differs, especially from the other carbon cycle, is this process, it takes millions of years. So the algae and the carbon inside of it will become oil, and it takes millions of years, and it will just kind of sit there for a long, long time. So instead of quickly going from, the air to a plant to an acorn to a squirrel, and then be breathed out by that squirrel back into the air, so it can be, that cycle can be repeated. In this carbon cycle, the carbon is actually being trapped in a goo that came from a million-year-old algae. And this is what we call a carbon sink. The carbon will stay under there, and as you can imagine, almost like a thermometer dropping, the Earth's thermometer is dropping as more and more algae are getting trapped underground, as more and more carbon is being turned into this stew called oil. More and more CO2 is leaving the atmosphere, being sucked in by the algae, and it's turning into a bigger and bigger pool of oil underground. Okay, so the temperature just drops and drops and drops as the Earth's greenhouse gases, the Earth's blankets that keep it warm, are slowly being sucked underground. Well, we found out later that oil can be burnt and it releases a ton of energy. So, what we did is we started using this goo, this fossil fuel, to power the industrial revolutions, to power our industry, to power our cars. We first had to get to the oil. So what man figured out is that almost as simple as using a straw to drink a juice box, you can drink the oil from the ground by using a straw. So we drilled through all that mud that would actually be many, many layers of rock by now. And we drilled through that, and we were able to suck it out from underground. But while we are sucking out that oil, we are bringing back that ancient CO2. We are draining that CO2 sink. We are bringing it back above ground in the form of oil. And that oil isn't necessarily CO2 directly unless you burn it, and then it will immediately become CO2. And that's kind of what we did. We took the oil and we made it into gasoline, or we burnt it directly, or we burnt it as coal or natural gas. And once we burnt it through the process of combustion, we were able to use it to power our cars, but by burning it, we create all this CO2. So burning fossil fuels has gotten us to where we are today. It's gotten us into the sky, as in airplanes, and it's allowed us to do a number of things, such as ship things from other countries to ours and vice versa. But we must realize that that entire time, as we're running our cars and running our power plants and running, flying airplanes, we are releasing CO2 this entire time because we are using fossil fuels to do these things. But we're noticing that all that CO2 is causing some dramatic things to occur. Melting ice caps, causing species to go extinct because their environments are becoming unstable, causing weather pattern changes, potentially creating stronger storms that create bigger problems such as more erosion, which takes away our soil, preventing us from planting as many crops and feeding as many people, and a big potential in creating more droughts and rain pattern changes that we cannot predict and therefore we cannot plan for. It is very hard to support over 7 billion people on this planet and include all those animals at the same time. So let's think about this. We still need cars. We still need power to run our industry. The problem is we cannot keep using fossil fuels because they are releasing too much CO2. The question is, what do we do? Well, we can suck the CO2 out of the environment, or we can rely on alternative energy, which mainly is utilizing the power of the sun to power our world, such as solar panels and using the power from wind, amongst others. But the big point here is that, once again, we cannot keep relying on burning fossil fuels for our energy. because it is adding more and more CO2 to the environment. In the other cycle we had talked about, it was kind of what they call a closed loop, in the way that you would have some organism releasing CO2, and then a plant absorbing that CO2, and then a animal perhaps using that plant for food and taking that carbon inside of its body, and then it would release that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, which then could go into the sky and stay there, or a plant could take it back in. But regardless, it was a closed loop system with not much additional CO2 being added to the atmosphere. It was just changing its form. But now what we are doing is we are taking carbon and potentially carbon dioxide from under the earth that has been there for millions and millions of years, and we are slowly putting it back into our atmosphere. So hopefully when you look at this whole entire issue, you realize that, CO2, carbon dioxide, is going to do what it's going to do. It's just going to absorb heat if sunlight hits it, and that's just what CO2 does, and it will trap heat if it's up there. And if it's not up there, that heat will not be caught. So much like a thermostat, if you want the heat on Earth to go up, just add CO2. And if you want the heat on Earth to go down, then all you need to do is remove the CO2. And it's more or less as simple as that when we're thinking of this issue, when it comes down to the very basic physics of climate change. Greenhouse gases, if they're up there, will make the Earth warmer. If they're not, the Earth will get cooler. So humans, whether we acknowledge it or we don't, will continue to make the Earth heat up and cause changes to the Earth as a whole if to continue to add CO2 to the air. It is not the boogeyman. If you just close your eyes, it's not going to go away. If we keep adding CO2, it will continue to accumulate and continue to make our planet warmer. So whether we acknowledge it or we don't, it's going to happen. So we need to lower CO2 emissions if we would like to keep the climate stable enough so organisms do not suffer from climate change. And the organisms I'm referring to are not just frogs, which are, as a whole, suffering from a changing environment due to climate change. It's not just coral reefs, which are heavily being affected by ocean conditions changing due to climate change. But I'm also referring to us, the organism that is Homo sapien, affected by climate change. As the climate changes, you will have things like stronger storms, which will cause more erosion, which will take away topsoil, which we need to plant food. It will cause things like droughts, which will cause less food and more famine, and cause many people to suffer in that way. If these things happen, there is no way we can support the billions of people that are currently on this planet, and projections say that many humans will die due to insufficient food and the potential hostilities that will happen between us as humans try to get what food is available. So there it is, we gotta limit the amount of CO2 we're putting up in the air if we want to get this climate change thing under control, because it's not a matter of really, saving the planet, and it really never was. The Earth is the only place humans have to call home and to live on, and if we affect it to such an extent that we can no longer live here, then we will no longer live here, meaning we can cause our own extinction. So this is serious, and a great thing to be talking about on a Saturday. So I hope you enjoyed it, and let's get to changing things, right?